Hello and welcome to episode 88 of Question and Answer. I am your host, Panyo Basa, and I'm very late on starting this Q&A, partly because I did a few videos with our good friend Brian Rue earlier today. And then after that, I was just kind of resting my throat for this one because we talked for a while. And my sweetheart was mad at me, which caused a certain tension in the air. So I'm kind of trying to chill from that. And then I get sucked into this heated exchange, this back and forth on my Discord server with a Pure Land Buddhist. And I'm sure you all know what Pure Land Buddhists can be like. So it's been a while. It's been a few hours of me sitting here. And it's time to start answering questions. And I'm sorry to disappoint any of you white nationalists out there by not having just 14 questions for episode 88, but we've got lots of questions. Not as many as lately, though. So this Q&A could be 2 hours or less, which is pretty good. And I'm looking very shiny. Look at my forehead. It's like shining. Okay, so I'm just going to wade right into this list of questions. And the first question is from Mooners. And Mooners says, what do you think of Boran Kamatana and the Yogavachara tradition? And is it compatible with the foundational teachings of the suttas? It is very influential in Thailand and Cambodia and seems to be influenced by Vajrayana. A similar thing exists in Burma, practiced by the Wezas. And it's kind of surprising to me that Mooners here knows about Burmese Wezas. I mean, most people outside of Burma don't know what Wezas are. But then again, I didn't know up until just an hour or so ago what Boran Kamatana is, or Yogavachara. I think I've heard of Yogavachara, but Boran Kamatana, I don't think I'd ever heard of before. Kamatana, I know that word because it is Pali for meditation. In fact, kamatan in Burmese means meditation. You know, what kind of kamatan do you do? You know, that kind of thing. So I looked it up in Wikipedia very briefly, and Boran Kamatana goes by the name of Esoteric Southern Buddhism. So it's like esoteric elements or magical elements of Theravada. And is it compatible with the foundational teachings of the suttas? I don't think so, because the Pali texts warn against doing magician stuff or fortune-telling stuff, or I don't think there's any mention of alchemy, but I'm pretty sure alchemy would be in there too. And the Wezas of Burma are essentially alchemists. They're not necessarily using metal, trying to turn metal into, like, base metal into gold. There's different kinds of Wezas. They're like, I think there's the iron Wezas, there's like mercury Wezas that are trying to make the philosopher's stone or whatever out of mercury. Then you've got certain other kind of Wezas that use mantras, or they use something called in, which is, it's like a diagram. Looks kind of like a tic-tac-toe board with some of the spaces filled with like esoteric symbols that supposedly have magic power. So yeah, there is some of that kind of stuff in Burma, but it's on the fringe. It's not considered to be like genuine Theravada. It's got elements of genuine Theravada, but then there's like the magician and alchemist stuff that's mixed in. And that stuff is considered to be not genuine teachings of the Buddha. And so is Boran Kamatana and the Yogavachara tradition, and is it compatible with the foundational teachings of the suttas? I mean, to the elements of it, you know, that accept the basic teachings of the suttas, yeah, those would be compatible. But overall, their emphasis is worldly. You know, you're not going to be trying to turn base metal into gold if you're a monk that's not even supposed to touch gold. But I'm not sure what kind of esoteric, tantric kind of stuff they're doing in Thailand and Cambodia and Laos and wherever else there is this Southern Buddhist esotericism. So, I mean, there are groups like that in Burma, but again, they're considered to be on the outskirts. And some of the, the Huizas aren't ordained monks, and they're largely mythological. I mean, the real Huizas that have formed kind of like they've become like the center of a kind of cult, that they're largely mythological beings. You know, they can't have sex with real human women because real human women eat meat and smell bad to them. So they have to go to the Himalayan mountains where there are flowers shaped like beautiful women, and they have sex with those instead. These kind of like legends have arisen in Burma anyway. Let's see. Yeah, I don't think it's entirely compatible with the foundational teachings of the suttas. But I'm no expert on this. I never really had anything to do. I never stayed at one of these monasteries in Burma. I knew a monk who did, and he was bragging about how his teacher, all he had to do was point at something to turn it into gold, which was even surpassing Midas himself. But again, I don't think all of this is just based on alchemy. There's probably other magical stuff, probably healing and like prognostication and so forth. But all of that is disapproved of or not encouraged, to say the least, in the Pali texts. Like even like doing atarva charms and so forth, it's specifically mentioned as something you should not do. Interpreting the cries of birds and all this kind of stuff. Yeah, I mean, you're just supposed to set that aside. That's all animal knowledge. And so I assume a lot of what is contained within this Yogavachara tradition or traditions would be stuff that is just obviously condemned in the Pali texts. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. And this is from Thermal Squid. And he wrote some very long questions, but I mean, a lot of it is just sort of like extraneous commentary. So if you want to read the entire thing, then you can just go to the previous Q&A, number 87, and look for Thermal Squid's comments. But I've pretty much just extracted the most important, what I consider to be the most important part in order to set the stage for the question. And I've even included the question itself. So there are question marks in these. So the first one is, how will one know when they are enlightened or beyond suffering? As it is obvious that even monks, mendicants, and sages still have occasional desires, moods, and mundane sufferings. So how do you know when you're enlightened? Well, that's I mean, it's a kind of trick question, because I have to answer it within a samsaric context, and you don't know you're enlightened within a samsaric context. So, I mean, if you know you're beyond suffering, if you just stop suffering, I mean, that would be a pretty good sign. Yeah, I mean, it is true that some people may think they're enlightened and be mistaken. So it's not just a subjective thing of just when you attain it, I mean, you'll know. I mean, yeah, this is one of those questions where, I mean, you're dealing with something that's off the scale, and you have to use words that are on the scale to try to talk about it. And anything that's on the scale just cannot touch what is off the scale. So we may assume that if you're really enlightened, you're going to know it. How exactly? That's another question. I don't think it can really be explained in words. But I do think that it may be at the surface, at the worldly level, that the human meat puppet is still going through the actions of being a human being, still has its programming to some degree. And somebody like Neem Karoli Baba, that I think may have been fully enlightened, you know, he laughed and cried, got angry sometimes. But the thing is, if you're enlightened and that sort of thing could even happen, you're not identified with it. I mean, it's just irrelevant. It's just energy, it's just nature taking its course, and you're no longer identified with that. But how you would exactly know is something different. And the dog wants to go outside and go potty, and I've just started this Q&A, And I think it's just going to have to poop on the floor or something. So let's see here. Ask the question again. I really do have this conscientious desire to answer a question as well as I can. I mean, if I just don't know the answer, I'll admit to it. But some of these questions are just very subtle. I mean, and some of them, like this one, I think, is just, I don't think there is an answer because the answer is off the scale. So, how will one know when they are enlightened or beyond suffering? You just know. I don't know. You just know, you know? But, yeah, I mean, it's just like a transcendental kind of an answer that I can't really give in words. I mean, you have to get there in order to know. So I'm just going to move on to Thermal Squid's next question, which is as follows. I think that maybe an even better clarification is wherein you compare and contrast Hindu renunciation and practice as endless purification and Buddhist practice as a matter of purification up until a certain point of which you say they jump out or bail out sideways. At what point is it proper to bail out or cash out, spiritually speaking? That seems to be an inherently arbitrary point that is determined or adjudicated by the ego consciousness or even the higher self that you may consider provisionally real but not ultimate reality. Well, getting back to the actual question with the question mark here, at what point is it proper to bail out or cash out, spiritually speaking? The Buddha would say, as soon as possible. As soon as you can. It's just that some people will have to go farther on the path before they're able to bail out. Some people may have to perfect fourth jhana before they can bail out. Some people will perfect fourth jhana and still not be able to bail out. And then other people won't even get to first jhana, but for some reason, they've got a certain talent or ripeness or whatever, and that'll be it. They can be just walking through the marketplace. Like there was some Zen monk, according to the legend, walking through the marketplace, and he's walking past a butcher, and this lady is asking the butcher, give me the best cut of meat you've got. And the butcher says, every cut of meat in this shop is the best cut of meat. And somehow it just clicked, and he became fully enlightened, supposedly. So, I mean, you can sometimes, I mean, you don't even have to be like in this exalted state of sagehood or sainthood before it happens. But, I mean, generally it happens when it's ready to happen. You do not have control over when exactly it happens because it's not something that you do. Something that you do is karma. And this is not karma. It's not the result of karma. Enlightenment is not the result of anything, because if it's the result of anything, then it is conditioned and it's not really enlightenment. It's going to be temporary and conducive to unease. So, yeah, at what point is it proper to bail out or cash out, spiritually speaking? In other words, at what point is it proper, at what point along the path is it proper to become fully enlightened? As soon as you can, as soon as it happens. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Ribalder. And I don't know if Ribalder and Mooners are in secret communication or something, or if they're the same person even. But Ribalder also asks a question that is similar to what Mooners asked. And that is, do you have any Ari monk stories? And again, I'm kind of surprised that anybody outside of Burma knows about the Maha Ari, who were a sect of Buddhism that existed in Burma in medieval times. In fact, I have read that the Burmese, the ethnic Burmese, were mainly followers of this Maha Ari tradition before they converted to Theravada. So they were already Buddhists before they became Theravada Buddhists. But according to the story, the Burmese, they migrated south from the foothills of the Himalayas. They're Tibeto-Burmese. They're related to the Tibetans, linguistically, probably genetically to some degree. They migrate down or invade whichever you prefer, into like central, like upper Burma. And they're probably already a kind of Buddhist at that time. And the Ari, the Maha Ari, based on what I've read about them, it was sort of tantric Buddhism. It was related to Tibetan Buddhism in some way. It was kind of like Tantrayana. And mainly, I think, what we know about the Ari monks comes from a Burmese chronicle, the Glass Palace Chronicle, or in Burmese it's called the Mannan Yazawin, which translates into Glass Palace Chronicle. And it's talking about the Maha Ari. And the word Ari comes from Aranya, which means forest. It doesn't come from Arya, like noble. It comes from Aranya, which means forest, because apparently a lot of them had forest monasteries. They were like forest monks. And according to the Glass Palace Chronicle, which may not be entirely reliable because it was probably composed by a Theravada Buddhist who did not have a very high opinion of the Maha Ari. The Maha Ari, one of the most notable things about them is that they had allegedly what's called the jus primae noctis, which means that any of the local girls, the night before her wedding, was sent to the Maha Ari monastery to be taught the arts of love, so to speak. So the Ari monks, the Maha Ari monks, got first crack at her, so to speak. No pun intended. Aside from that, according to the Glass Palace Chronicle, they drank alcohol. I think they ate dinner in the afternoon, and they practiced martial arts, some kind of boxing. So it was a fairly corrupt form of Buddhism, and it's understandable why King Anuruddha decided that they should convert to Theravada, which was a more, what should I call it, just a more solid, genuine kind of teaching of Buddha Vachana. It was more genuine. And might as well give a little more on the legendary conversion of Theravada, or legendary conversion of Burma to Theravada, in that at the time, this was like the 11th century, the 1000s. And Pagan was the Burmese capital in central Burma. There were also a few other groups. There were a group called the Pew, who lived in like around the area of Pie, or I guess it used to be called Prom in the British times. And also the Muns in the south, they were Theravadins. And the Burmese farther north were like this Maha Ari sect. And there was a Mun monk missionary called in Burmese Shin Arahan, who went to the king, King Anuruddha, and did his missionary thing and converted King Anuruddha to Theravada Buddhism, or at least, it might have been like a political decision, just this will be better for my people, it will unify the people better, or some such. So kings being what they were in those days, King Anuruddha just unilaterally decreed, from now on, we're Theravada Buddhist. There is some indication, like in Pagan, there are at least a few temples in the old capital city of Pagan that apparently were still Maha Ari temples. So the Aris still existed. And I have been told that they still have like a vestigial influence. The tradition has like a vestigial influence on Shan Buddhism, certain areas of Shan state, which would be a mountainous plateau on the east side of the nation of Myanmar. And the Shan are more closely related to the Thais. In fact, Shan and Siam have the same etymology. So they were originally pretty much the same people. Some of them migrated into the Shan Plateau and became Shan. Other ones migrated into what is now Thailand and become Siamese or Thais. So I guess I've told the Ari monk stories that I know. I don't know any specific stories about Ari monks other than just the jus primae noctis and the martial arts and the booze drinking and like eating dinner. That's about the extent of my knowledge of the Maha Ari sect in like early medieval Burma. So, Rybalder's next question here is, did you consider becoming an Ari wizard? Well, in my younger, hornier days, I used to kind of like the idea of that jus prime noctis. But, I mean, it's like a lot of guys would think, wow, I mean, that'd be the way to go, is become a Maha Ari monk where you're drinking and wrestling and having sex and all this. But it really wasn't an option because the Maha Aris no longer exist, as far as I know. Maybe some remote valley up in Shan State somewhere. So, I mean, I thought about what it would have been like if it were an option. But probably it would have been a mistake. I would have been following my lower impulses by making the decision to ordain with the Aris rather than just becoming a good boy, like a well-behaved celibate Theravada bhikkhu. So I guess I answered that question too. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Joe Doe. And I hope this is recording. I'm still kind of paranoid from the other recording software that I had that would say that it was recording and then turned out not to be recording, so that I had to do the same Q&A twice. I think once I even had to do it the same Q&A 3 times. And it's like, 2 hours plus. So, next question is from Joe Doe, which is, how do you deal with noise during meditation? I live near a fairly busy road and sometimes feel my meditation doesn't go anywhere sometimes because of the noise. Is it still worth trying to meditate? Well, I got a story about this one. It's, if you've ever lived in Southeast Asia, you know that Southeast Asian people and people that live in so-called third world countries or not fully developed countries in general seem to like noise. There's like village loudspeakers blasting throughout Southeast Asia, or at least throughout Burma. And for a monk, you have to live within walking distance of a village because that's where you get your daily meal. And if you're within relatively easy walking distance to a village, you're within hearing distance of the loudspeakers blasting monks chanting or cheesy pop music or village news or, the winning lotto numbers, that kind of stuff. So finding a really quiet place is not easy, even if you're living in like Buddhist Southeast Asia. So, there is that. But the story that I was going to tell was, I spent 2 months doing intensive meditation practice at Pandita Rama in Rangoon. This was before the new hermitage got built and became like the main place where Westerners go. They were like working on it, but they hadn't finished it yet. There were some monks staying there, but I was in Rangoon with U Pandita himself. And the Burmese, like I say, at the very least, they're indifferent to noise, and a lot of them just downright like noise. And like just about any other monastery in Burma, it was under construction. There's always at least one building getting built there, or some kind of hubbub going on. And there was a guy with a hammer hammering out sheet metal gutters at the monastery, just right underneath the eaves of the meditation hall. And it was just bang, 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 bang. You're sitting there trying to meditate, and there's a guy literally pounding on sheet metal with a hammer just right underneath the eaves of the building. And it was something that I was having to work on. It's obviously, the Seattle U Pandita, he knew about it, and he wasn't telling them to go somewhere else and pound on their metal elsewhere. So one time during a meditation interview, I happened to start mentioning how the pounding of the sheet metal was very loud and it was distracting me at first. And then I just reached this zone where it's like the sound was just coming in one ear and just going out the other ear. It was just like washing through me like a light just going through a window pane. And as I started to explain this about the pounding and the sheet metal and so forth, he just suddenly sucked air through his teeth, like, because he was getting ready to attack, because he was an angry man, and despite his skill at meditation and all, when he wasn't meditating, he was an angry man, and he just didn't like me very much. And so he was just getting ready to attack, just lay into me. But then, I said it didn't bother me. It was just like, it's just going right through me. And then so he couldn't do anything other than just violently suck air through his teeth for half a second. So I think if you can't find a really quiet place, and using earplugs or something, it doesn't work, because for me, it just distracts me having the earplugs in there. So maybe you could try some white noise, turn on a fan, or just some kind of just uniform hum that will kind of drown out the traffic outside. But otherwise, you may have to do what everyone had to do at Pandita Rama back around, gosh, when was that? Like 1997. And that's just, observe the sound. It's like your primary meditation might just be hearing. And if any kind of like irritation or anything starts to arise because of the noise, you observe the irritation. Just whatever arises, just be mindful of it. And that can work. And if you were at a place like Pandita Rama in 1997, it bloody well had to work, because you didn't have any other options other than just leave the place. So, it's still worthwhile trying to meditate. That's the answer. The answer is yes. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here, which is Palden Dorje, also known as the Little Buddha in his younger days, is said to have sat in meditation for 11 months straight without moving. The site where he sat was constantly visited by pilgrims and was under military supervision. Do you think this is possible? Well, I think just about anything is possible. I think it is possible to break the laws of physics. I tried to say physics and nature at the same time and just wound up just sort of blurting out gibberish there. But I do think that just about anything imaginable is possible. But that's not the same as saying that it's likely. I think the odds of that being just like a bogus legend are higher than somebody sitting in meditation for 11 months straight. It may be that he went into some kind of suspended animation, like super hibernation, where he didn't have to eat, maybe hardly breathe. His metabolic processes just kind of almost stopped. That can happen. I've never heard of it happening for 11 months straight, though. So, the only time I ever heard of the Little Buddha, not the movie, but the person, was just a few Q&A episodes ago. It may be the same person. Maybe Joe Doe here asked me about Little Buddha the first time, and I'd never heard of him before then. And somebody wrote a comment under his question saying that the person, Palden Dorje, was now implicated in numerous crimes. I don't remember what the crimes were exactly, other than some of them were of a sexual nature. So it's hard to say. I really don't know. I think that it is possible, but I don't think that it's extremely likely that Occam's razor would probably choose a different option than that it really was legit. Sort of like David Hume wrote about miracles. It's like you should believe a story about a miracle only if the falseness of the story would be more miraculous than the miracle itself. And in this case, I lived in Asia. I know how well legends propagate. I've heard legends come around about me that were obviously not true. Like there's supposedly a photograph. I've mentioned this before. There was a photograph circulating around the city of Monua of me actually levitating over the city. And I would just kind of joke it off and say, well, I think it must be somebody else because I don't remember doing that. But like legends of monks being fully enlightened, that's all a monk has to do in Burma anyways. to get the reputation for being fully enlightened is he just has to be relatively strict and actually meditate and mind his own business in a forest or a cemetery or some such place. And the dogs are getting really antsy. You guys better just stop it. Nope. You're not going outside. Man. Just talking to them sometimes gets them even more riled up. They're getting attention. It's like fueling their system somehow. So, let's see. Yeah, okay, I answered that one. I'm going to move on to Jodo's next question. Do you think the fluoride in the water supply is affecting people's spiritual growth, given that it severely damages the pineal gland that has been represented as the energy point of the third eye? Well, I'm certainly not Cartesian in my philosophy, and I'm not a materialist. So it may be that in this version of reality, fluoridated drinking water is causing some kind of damage to people's pineal glands, which somehow makes them less able to attain liberating insight or some such. But I mean, it's going to be a karma thing more than a material fluoridated water thing. The fluoridated water may be just a kind of gimmick of translating people's karma into this version of samsara. So, yeah, the pineal gland, being the energy point of the third eye, I'm a little bit skeptical of that even. Yeah, the pineal gland it's largely vestigial. I assume it still has some function, but it's not nearly as important in us as it was in, say, prehistoric amphibians. Or the tuatara, for example, who still has the pineal eye as a reptile. Looks like an iguana kind of, but it's got a third eye, literally. So, yeah, I don't think it's the fluoride in the water is affecting people's spiritual growth so much as it is their own karma, which is largely culturally conditioned. And you guys stop running back and forth through the house. Seriously. So, yeah, my sweetheart isn't here right now. And so they're running amok and they're restless because nobody's paying attention to them. Okay, I guess I answered that one. I'm going to move on to the next question, which is from Gaz. And Gaz says, do you have any special plans for Q&A 100? I haven't really been thinking about it, but I mean, I could do a live stream maybe. I don't think I'd stoop so low as to charge money for answering questions. But yeah, I mean, that's possible. Why not? Maybe. I'm not going to make any promises, but yeah, that's a possibility. Unless you guys have some ideas for a Q&A 100 that are better than my ideas. But otherwise, I don't know what I would do. Like the live stream would be the obvious choice, but I might even do a live stream before I get to 100. Who knows? So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from DKMN. And DKMN says, I've always disliked the idea that you could pray your sins away without any effort to redeem yourself. The thought that assaulters and murderers go to heaven for simply believing in Christ seems backwards. That being said, how would people who committed violent crimes repent in Buddhism? Well, with regard to repentance, there is an implication of regret or remorse involved. And really, regret or remorse, I've mentioned this many times by now, is always unskillful, bad karma. Bad karma. So, mainly, what you're supposed to do, if you do something, some major transgression, say, is just, acknowledge that you committed a major transgression, maybe harmed other people, and resolve to try to do better in future and really take that to heart. That's the best you can do in that sense. Although also there is a sutta where the Buddha compares bad karma to a handful of salt. And I've mentioned this a number of times. And it's like a simile. You take that handful of salt and pour it into a glass of water. You can't drink the water because it's too salty. But you take that same handful of salt and pour it into a pool of crystal clear water. and then you let it dissolve. You can drink it, you hardly taste the salt at all because it is diluted down with this pure water. And that's really the best you can do with regard to bad karma that you have committed, because no priest is going to be able to wave a magic wand at you or make you recite Hail Marys or whatever, or absolve you and make your karma go away, because, I mean, it just has to take its natural course. You can't just magically make it go away, at least according to Buddhism, or at least according to Theravada Buddhism. So if you've committed some major transgression, some major unethical act, the best thing you can do is just try to overwhelm that and drown it out by doing lots of good things. You know, help little old ladies across the street, and you know, feed hungry people, and, you know, whatever you can think of that is beneficial, go for it. So I guess the most famous example of someone who committed violent crimes, more or less repenting in Buddhism, would be Anguli Mala, who was literally a serial killer. And he'd killed like 99 people and was going to kill the Buddha himself as number 100. First, he was going to kill his own mother, not recognizing who she was, I think. And the Buddha, with his divine eye, you know, clairvoyance, he saw what was going on, and so he intervened and sort of distracted Anguli Mala away from the old lady. And Anguli Mala started chasing after him. And the Buddha was just walking at a normal pace, and no matter how fast Anguli Mala ran after him, he couldn't catch him. So then he knew something was up. And the Buddha used that sort of mind-blowing psychic feat as a way of kind of getting Anguli Mala snapped out of the serial killer mindset. You know, just blew his mind. And then he was able to teach him a few choice words of wisdom that really sank deep into Anguli Mala and converted him to Buddhism. And a little while after that, he was ordained as a monk, and he actually became enlightened. And there's the famous story, I think I mentioned it even in the previous Q&A, where Anguli Mala was walking for alms in the village, some village, and he heard there was a woman having like a really difficult labor. You know, she was in childbirth, and it was a difficult one. And her life and the life of the baby were in peril. And so Anguli Mala stopped and made like a solemn avowal of truth. And that is, you know, since I became a Buddhist and became a monk, I have not harmed any living being. By the power of this truth, may you be well. And apparently, the power of the truth made her well, or just his psychic, like, faith healing ability or something. Just the depth of that truth that he stated was so powerful that it had like an effect that saved the life of the woman and her baby. So I can't remember though if Anguli Mala died a violent death. Even though he became enlightened, he still had the residual karma from his past. And so bad things would keep happening to him. People would like be throwing rocks at him and stuff when they found out that he was the serial killer that killed off Uncle Joe and so forth. So, yeah, I mean, you still, even becoming enlightened is not going to completely evaporate all of your past karma. It's still going to be there, at least to some degree. But you can still get enlightened anyway, if you really set your mind on it. Really dedicate yourself, as Anguli Mala did. So, I don't know if I've answered this question, though. I've always disliked the idea you could pray your sins away. Yeah, I've never really saw much validity to that myself. The thought of without any effort to redeem yourself. I think the whole idea of Christianity is that Jesus Christ redeemed himself so that you don't have to, because you couldn't anyway. But again, I'm not a Christian, so I have difficulty accepting that idea. So I guess I answered that question. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Cify. And Cify says, how one distinguishes between a culture and Buddha's teachings. And somebody left a comment under that saying, that's a good question. But for me, it's a little bit difficult to answer because to some degree the Buddhist teachings are a culture. Culture is just sort of like knowledge that is transmitted from one person to the next, or not even necessarily knowledge, like beliefs that are transmitted from one person to the next, one generation to the next. And Buddhist teachings have become a kind of culture. They're the only reason we still have the Buddhist teachings, not just like ultimate truth, which is everywhere all the time, but like this approach to realizing ultimate truth is through culture. So, I mean, the Buddha himself was immersed in ancient Indian culture, and a lot of his teachings they're cultural to some degree. I mean, he had to speak a language. The language is cultural. He just adopted certain assumptions of the Iron Age Ganges Valley, like cosmology and so forth, that sort of thing was just accepted as, what people believed. So that's culture. So the only part of the Buddhist teachings that aren't culture would be, first of all, just what he was like, nirvana itself. The attainment of this state of no more greed, hate, or delusion. That would not be in and of itself cultural, because that is just off the scale. Culture can't touch it. And to some degree, you could say that aspects of like Buddhist ethics and how to attain this state, how to get closer to the state of enlightenment, there are non-cultural elements of that. And the dogs are acting up again. Is there anybody out there? No. Yeah, you hear somebody walking a dog or something out there. So you could say that some aspects of the Buddhist teachings are sort of like the teachings of Immanuel Kant in the West, where, he's just sort of breaking down human nature empirically or objectively, just a deep understanding of how the human mind works, which is not necessarily cultural, although the ability to go in that direction might be largely cultural. And the dogs they're just running amok. So how do you distinguish between a culture and Buddhist teachings? Like, the higher up you go, the less cultural it's going to be. The more refined and ethereal you get, it's going to become less cultural. Just like with, say, Christian mysticism also. You start off at the biblical, purely cultural level, but then you get, the higher up you go, like practicing high contemplation or something, you're leaving culture behind. And it works in any religion at the most elementary level, the level that any normie could comprehend. That's cultural. But then you get more and more refined as you rise above samsara, so to speak. The less samsaric it is, the less cultural it's going to be. So I hope I answered that one, because I'm moving on to the next one. And that's, do you think Albert Camus' philosophy goes along Buddhist teachings on some level? There's a certain amount of overlap between Camus and Buddhism. My understanding is that Albert Camus was like a literary existentialist. I think he's pretty much considered to be a 20th century existentialist philosopher who nevertheless mostly wrote fiction. I mean, he did write The Myth of Sisyphus, which I read a long time ago, and I thought that it was very underwhelming. I was not impressed by his non-fiction, although some of his fiction I liked. But if you really want to know, like, the interface between existentialism and Buddhism, your best bet would be to read Venerable Nyanavira, especially his letters, because there was this famous monk, Nyanavira. He was a friend of the first famous Nyanamoli. They were ordained in Sri Lanka around 1950. And this Nyanavira, before he became a monk, he was heavily into existentialist philosophy. And so after he became a monk, he was doing his best to integrate Buddhist philosophy with existentialism. And mainly his main idea was that in existentialism, you just get to this dead end. It's like all you can do is just backtrack and become a mystic or something, or just bleak despair. And Buddhism sort of picks up the baton, takes the ball, so to speak, from the existentialists and continues going, because the existentialists didn't know how to get beyond just this bleak, empty, despair-inducing meaninglessness. But his philosophy is so complex, and I really never considered Jnanavira's philosophy to be very compelling. I mean, he's got unenlightenment as so complicated that you wonder how a frog can manage to be unenlightened. But if you really want to study, sort of the similarities and differences of existentialism and Theravada Buddhism, the letters of Jnanavira and plus maybe his notes on Dhamma would be your best bet. But overall, Albert Camus, I don't think he really, he wasn't a Buddhist. There's just certain more or less coincidental similarities between existentialism and Buddhism. Just sort of like the idea of ultimate emptiness sort of thing. But I don't think that existentialism really had like an ethical system. It wasn't really based on morality or self-purification, no meditation, no existentialist meditation techniques that I know of. So, just read Jnanavira. I'm sure you can find it. That it's probably free online, because Jnanavira does have more followers now than he did when he was alive. There are a lot of Western monks who take Jnanavira very seriously, although I was never one of them. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Mara Maid Mahayana, who I'm pretty sure is the same as Bodhisattva 969. And Mara Maid Mahayana says, should one support monks who do not follow Vinaya with donations? This specifically means personally accepting money, as happens again and again in Thailand. Your personal opinion on this? At the moment, I only support the forest monastery Mutodea in Germany, in which 6 German, Swiss, Swedish forest monks live. I consider them to be strict when it comes to the Vinaya. Well, I felt that way. I still feel that way, that as a general rule, you should support strictly practicing monks. That if you've got lax monks who'll handle money, if they compensate for that in some way by giving you valuable teachings, for example, they help you out in life, then maybe. But even then, it would be better to find their attendant and give the money to the attendant, saying, this is for such and such monk. And at least your hands are clean, so to speak, even though the attendant's probably just going to hand it over to the monk later. So, yeah, I've come across this, and as a general rule, I would not support monks that handle money. I certainly wouldn't give them any money. I wouldn't donate money to a monk, put it directly into his hands, even if I knew he handled money and I really was grateful to him for some reason. Then still, I'd donate the money to his attendant, and then it's on the attendant if he's going to just hand it over to the monk, because of course, monks are not allowed to handle money except under very rare, unusual circumstances. And then it's not their money. They're just, like, for example, if a monk finds money on monastery property, it's his duty to pick it up and put it in a safe place until the owner of it comes back looking for it. Or sometimes, if a monk is guilty of handling money and he's going to come clean and forfeit that money, which pretty much never happens, then according to Vinaya, he offers it up to the monks, and then one monk will be chosen to take that money and go throw it out in the woods somewhere. So, the monk that's appointed to throw the money out in the woods, he'd be allowed to touch money, but it wouldn't be his money. So, yeah, to support the strictest, wisest monks does make sense, and it also helps lax monks to want to be more strict. Because I noticed in Burma, it's the more faithful the lay people are, the more lax the monks tend to be. As a general rule, there are exceptions to this. But that's because, if the lay people are looking at the monks and the lay people know the rules and they're saying, that monk doesn't follow the rules, but this monk over here does, so I'm going to support this monk. Then it causes just a general improvement in like Vinaya practice, just strictness of practice in general among the monks. But if you got people like in northern Burma or north central Burma who just have faith in all monks and they're afraid to criticize monks because they think they might go to hell for criticizing monks, and so then the monks are just lax as a general rule. So yeah, I would advise you mainly to support the strictest monks, unless there is some monk who has been helpful to you, or he's obviously got a good heart even though he's not following the rules strictly, and he's got some wisdom maybe. Then even then, if you're going to support him with money, you give the money to the monastery attendant, or you can offer them food or whatever is allowable. Although I wouldn't offer them food for the next day, because they'll just put it in the cupboard in the kitchen or something and just eat it the next day, which is also against the rules. So offer them something that at least won't be against the rules. But I mean, you've got a monk who's sick or something and he needs some kind of medicine and you can afford to get him a bottle of pills or something. I mean, you're still doing good. There is a sutta talking about how it's a very mechanistic cookbook kind of Dharma that makes me kind of a little skeptical of it, but it is orthodox Theravada, that you get benefits for 100 lifetimes for doing a good deed to an animal. And then it goes up to there's like different levels where it's like you got the common layperson, the wise layperson, you got like the sloppy monk, you got the good but still unenlightened monk, you got the enlightened monk, you got the Buddha at the top, and I think even higher than the Buddha is offering something to the Sangha of the Four Quarters, because that includes all the Arahants and the Buddha himself and all the other monks. So that's the highest merit you get for donating, is when you donate to the entire Sangha of the Four Quarters. But even offering something to a sloppy monk, you're still earning merit, because it is a generous act that you're performing, and it's your own generosity that's determining your karma. Although in Theravada they also throw in the wisdom of the person you're donating to, because there's some sort of metaphysical interaction between your mind and the mind of the being you're donating to. So I guess I answered that question. So I'm just going to move on to a next question, which is from Nature Cure. And this is kind of a complicated question despite how short it is. Nature Cure says, in Digha Nikaya 22 on Arya Atangika Mega on Sama Ajiva, it says, noble disciple is NE path, which is Noble Eightfold Path. It took me a while to figure that one out. For enlightened people, Seka or Sodapana FE after all. FE, I'm not sure what the FE stands for. Fully enlightened, maybe? Anyway, mainly it's Digha Nikaya, Sutta number 22. It's talking about the Noble Eightfold Path, the Atangika Mega, and Sama Ajiva means right livelihood. And it says noble disciple, which would be like Arya Savaka. And because it's referring to the Arya Savaka having right livelihood, he's asking, is the Noble Eightfold Path just for enlightened people or for Aryas, for Buddhist saints, people who have had at least a glimpse of Nibbana? And I don't think that's necessarily the case. Partly the word Arya, it had more than one meaning. And in very early times, it just meant noble. So when he says a noble disciple, he's not necessarily saying that they have to be at one of the four stages of sainthood. That it could just mean something like a gentleman. It's just sort of like a kind of honorific, just a polite way of speaking. So I would guess that mainly here when it says the noble disciple, or the Aryan disciple, the Arya Savaka, that it could just mean something like gentleman, because Arya was originally an ethnic thing that later became a class thing that later became like a Buddhist technical term for someone who was like with high attainments. But I mean, Arya originally was the name of the tribe or group of tribes that invaded not only northwestern India, but also much of like Central Asia and like Iran especially. In fact, the name Iran or Iran is a corruption of Aryan. So they invaded, they became the ruling class. So they became like the nobles. And that's how it came to mean like noble. But it also meant like civilized people at first. So you go through the evolution of the meaning of the word Arya in northern India. And so first it just meant, you were a member of the tribe that became the ruling class after it invaded. And then it just meant like an ethnic state or ethnic class. You're the light-skinned, taller people that are more likely to have brown hair and blue eyes, that they're like the most well-off people. They're like the gentry, like in 18th century England. You had like the upper classes, so they became like that. And then later it just meant noble in general, noble in a more ethical sense or spiritual sense. So it could mean here that it's just sort of a polite mode of speaking. The noble disciple is, or the Aryan disciple, the Arya Savaka. It's not necessarily referring to Buddhists who already have high attainments. Although there is a Sama Ajiva for monks, even though they're not working for a living anymore. Sama Ajiva, it means essentially, not scheming for money and following the rules and being worthy of the alms food that you eat and so forth. But here, I'm pretty sure it's referring to any Buddhist. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Newman. And this is actually two questions. I need to separate these. One moment, please. There, okay, I'm done. So the first question is, how tough was learning the Pali language and Burmese? And I can say that Pali and Burmese are relatively easy languages. Pali, for example, does not have a really high vocabulary. It doesn't have lots and lots of words. So also it's Indo-European, so it's kind of similar to like Latin or Greek. And it's fairly easy to understand. There are some weird like declensions or like verb tenses and stuff that's probably the hardest part of Pali, is just getting the weird like verb forms and stuff. They follow rules and everything, but they're like archaic, like a passive. I can't remember if it's like, I can't even remember. It's like the reflexive mode or something of verbs that they're found in older texts, but it become very rare later on, just because it was just sort of this archaic complication in the language. Pali is like a streamlined language. It started off, the ancestor of Pali would be Vedic Sanskrit. And it's much simpler than Sanskrit, partly because I've read that it was never really a vernacular language spoken by ordinary villagers and townspeople, that it was a monastic kind of language that was a kind of amalgam of different North Indian languages, that it was like a lingua franca that monks from different monasteries could communicate with each other using the Pali language. So the Buddha did not technically speak Pali, or at least that is the position of most Western scholars who specialize in the subject. But he spoke something similar to Pali. Probably, Pali and the Buddha's original language would be mutually intelligible most of the time. So how tough was learning the Pali language? It really wasn't that tough. There are just a few complications like the weird verb forms and stuff. But like I said, it doesn't have a really big vocabulary, and there's a lot fewer just like irregular verbs and so forth like in English. English is relatively complex, difficult to learn language. So those of us who were born into an English-speaking culture had a certain advantage. With regard to Burmese, it's also a relatively simple language. Like the grammar is, some people even say that the grammar is non-existent. There is no Burmese grammar, but there is Burmese grammar. It's just very simple. And the hardest thing for a Westerner with regard to learning Burmese is the pronunciation. Because Burmese, it's a monosyllabic language in general. Most words have only one syllable. And there are sounds in the Burmese language that either are not found in English, or the distinctions between this sound and a very similar sound are not, they're not distinguished in English. Like no means to wake up in Burmese. No, I don't even remember what it means, but it doesn't mean to wake up. Like mokonde means it's rainy, but mokonde means it's a drought. So it's just this slight, you get more aspiration to the K, makes the difference between rainy and drought. And it's very difficult. Like there's like 4 tones. It's a tonal language. So let's see. Lot means to work. Lo means because of. Lo means to desire. And lo is the worst cuss word in the Burmese language. So you have to be really careful about exactly how you pronounce things. Because if you just used like an English kind of pronunciation, then Burmese people are going to stare at you like you're speaking Greek. They're not going to know what the hell you're saying. So that's the hardest part of Burmese. Probably the hardest part of Pali is that there really are no native speakers of Pali. That is like a dead language like Latin, spoken almost entirely by monks and Buddhist scholars. And so, it's like a part-time language. You're not going to be immersed in it as a general rule. You might find some monasteries like in Sri Lanka where the monks are all speaking Pali to each other. Then it'd probably be easier to learn there. So I guess I answered that question. I mean, both Pali and Burmese are easier to learn than English. They're on a par with like Spanish. Although Burmese pronunciation is tricky for people who are not born into a language with like a tonal language and this very fine distinctions between consonant sounds and so forth. So I'll just move on to Newman's next question here. Did the Burmese view you as a white foreigner any different to Burmese monks? Well, some Burmese people really are racist. They're Burmese chauvinists. They think that to be Burmese is the highest form of human life on this planet, which is to be expected from a traditional culture. Just about any culture, except for the modern liberal West, considers their own people to be the best people. It's, I think, the only major group of people on the planet that are prejudiced against their own ethnicity are liberal Westerners. So, I mean, there are a few sort of xenophobic Burmese people, but they would leave me alone. I wouldn't really be confronted by them, very rarely. But the thing is, the Burmese in the past, I don't know about now, but in the past, they considered America to be like a heaven realm where everyone is rich and beautiful and happy. And I was told repeatedly that the villagers where I would be living just loved me more than they loved the abbot of the monastery, more than they loved the Burmese monks around. Partly because, in their view, I had renounced my own life, renounced my own family, renounced my own rich, beautiful, happy culture, as they perceived it, in order to go and live in poverty with them. And they felt vindicated and proud that someone would actually abandon, wealth and luxury as they view it. From their point of view, it was wealth and luxury, in order to come and adopt their religion, what they considered to be sacred, and practice it at a higher level than they were willing to practice or able to practice. Because I was taking it very seriously. I was trying to be as strict as I could. So, yeah, they just, a lot of them just adored me. And sometimes it was a problem because I go for alms round. There are a few times there'd be a line of like 100 people waiting at the outskirts of the village to offer me food. And they're really not good at engineering problems, like the idea that 100 people can't each put in 10% of a bowl full of food into one bowl. So, yeah, I was especially in northwestern Burma, I was sort of like Colonel Kurtz in Apocalypse Now, except without the heads on poles. That it really, I was just venerated as a saint. So I'm not trying to brag here, so I just move on to the next question here. This is from Cardinal Giovanni. And Cardinal Giovanni says, was the Buddha before his awakening a Jain ascetic? He tortured himself, or these 5 ascetics that abandoned him at first, were they Jains? There's no mention in the text of the Buddha being a Jain. That Jainism really is not praised or anything. That he had 2 teachers before his enlightenment, 2 meditation instructors. Neither one of those are claimed to be Jains. So the thing is that the Buddha, before his enlightenment, he was trying what was the traditional thing to try in order to liberate yourself from samsara and suffering. And there were 2 main ways of going about it. One was samatha meditation, and the other was self-torture, just severe asceticism, austerity. And it wasn't just the Jains who did that. It was common in Indian culture at the time, especially Indian religious culture, that those are really your 2 routes, which is samatha meditation, or like cultivating kind of trance states, for lack of a better word, through meditation, or just torturing yourself. And so there were other groups like Ajivikas. There were a number of Ajivika schools, but there's no mention of the Buddha being an Ajivika either. The matted hair ascetics who were Brahmins worshiping the sacred fire out in the woods, they did some pretty severe austerity also. At least some of them did. So, I mean, it was just a common thing. And if we follow the tradition, then the Buddha, I mean, he wasn't really following a tradition. He was doing it on his own. And then he sort of joined up with these 5 ascetics who apparently, I mean, there's no mention of their philosophy or anything like that before his enlightenment, other than just, this is how we purify ourselves. We work off our bad karma by torturing ourselves, or just work on equanimity by torturing ourselves, and attain these deep meditative states, jhanic states. And the 2 teachers who were teaching him meditation, I mean, they're not mentioned as members of any particular religious movement or spiritual movement. So it's all left kind of vague. And the idea is that he was sort of non-denominational before he invented Buddhism, or discovered Dharma, if you prefer. So let's see. I guess I answered that question. Yeah, there's no indication that he was a Jain. Just the fact that he tortured himself doesn't mean that he was a Jain, because there were lots of people in various philosophical, spiritual schools that were torturing themselves back then, because that was just the traditional thing to do in India at that time. So I'll just move on to Cardinal Giovanni's next question, which is, in Vinaya books, there are the group of 6 monks, because of which there were many new rules formulated. They were naughty monks. What happened to them? Have they become eventually enlightened? And yeah, they're in the Vinaya. Like, each rule has like an origin story. It explains why the Buddha made the rule in the first place. And there was this group of 6 monks that were just doing all kinds of rotten stuff. They were just complete rascals, just boneheads, which, among other things, indicates that not all of the Buddha's disciples were wise. You're going to have fools in any group. So let's see. Now the dog's whining to go outside again. The group of 6 monks, and I don't know if the group of 6 monks really existed historically. I mean, they give their names. Like Punabasuka wasn't one of them. I remember that because it's similar to Panyobasa, which was mine. So it was like my dark alter ego was Punabasuka. But I mean, some of the stuff they were doing is just so over the top that you can't, it's hard for me to accept that this group of 6 monks really did all these horrible things. And if you read the rules for bhikkhunis, there was also the group of 6 nuns who were just like the twin sisters of these group of 6 monks who were doing the same kind of stuff. So I think a lot of the time, if they didn't have a really obvious story, origin story for a rule, they would just attribute it to the group of 6. You know, they were pretty much responsible for all nondescript naughtiness. So what happened to them afterwards? It's hard to say. I don't think it says. Maybe in the commentarial tradition, it says what eventually happened to this group of 6 monks. 6 monks. But I would assume that they got some kind of bad rebirth, but then because of the benefits they got from being in the presence of the Buddha and so forth, that eventually they're going to become enlightened, sort of like Devadatta. You know, Devadatta is like the Buddhist equivalent, rough equivalent of Judas Iscariot, where, you know, he's actually trying to kill the Buddha, but fails. And right now, he's allegedly roasting in the lowest pits of Avicii hell, but eventually he's going to become a Pacceka Buddha. He's going to become, you know, higher than an ordinary arahant. It might be, you know, a zillion gajillion years from now, but he is destined for enlightenment. And the group of 6 might be in a similar situation, but I really can't say. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from the proto-pseudo-monk, alias Cool Whip. And the proto-pseudo-monk, alias Cool Whip, you guys stop it, says, why is Ajahn Nyanamoli Terra... What are you doing? Just a minute. The dog wants to get up here. Ugh. How you doing? This is Tater. She eats bugs. Don't you, Tater? Yeah. So the proto-pseudo-monk says, why is Ajahn Nyanamoli Terra absolutely jacked from Hillside Hermitage? The dude monk is a meatball. I don't think he means that in a bad sense. On some of his videos, there are massive kettlebells behind him. Some say he supplements with amino acids. I didn't think monks were allowed to be so obscenely hench, non-accidentally. I don't know what hench means, but I assume it means jacked or ripped or shredded or swole, something along those lines. So anyways, I didn't think monks were allowed to get so obscenely hench non-accidentally. It seems contradictory to renunciation, right? I had renounced bulking because I thought it was beautification of the body, as I heard some eating precept, you take the food saying not for athleticism nor beautification. But personally, weightlifting was the first activity that gave me a path to cultivate discipline and effort. So I would love to hear the ethics on weightlifting, Master Panyobasa. I've become a morbidly weak, emaciated, hibernating squirrel because of the Dhamma, abstaining from physical exercise. Although sat at the desk all day, it's not really abstaining. It's a lack of effort. Unless you become intoxicated, it seems like it can only be beneficial to stay healthy, at least until Nibbana is seen. Muscle strength is linked with longevity. Maybe it's time for bulking, but if the body doesn't exist, do you see any benefit to physical exercise from a spiritual point of view? The final question may succinctly capture the introductory essay. Thanks. And then he continues, like, how do you justify to your supporters needing those daily mega 3,000 calories and all that protein? I can't even afford that shit for myself. No right food, no exercise, and in a year you are looking like a feeble bag of bones, which I thought was what monks were meant to look like. Okay, so the main question is up at the top here, I think. Let's see, where's the question mark? Oh, there's a couple question marks. One is, why is Ajahn Nyanamoli Terra absolutely jacked? Yeah, well, apparently he does work out, and it may be that he's taken like amino acids, and I assume he's not getting testosterone injections or anything. But on the one hand, he is like a macho, strict forest monk kind of a person. And macho, strict forest monks, to some degree, I mean, it was like that with me to some degree, where you're living out in the woods in a rough circumstance. that it just kind of brings up like caveman instincts. And just, I mean, there were times when I was fairly muscular, even though I wasn't really exercising much. I mean, I wasn't doing any kind of calisthenics or weightlifting or anything. It was mostly just walking a lot. And, you know, you got to do the cut wood, carry water stuff, you know, at a forest monastery. You know, you're pulling up buckets from the well and filling a 5-gallon bucket and then like carrying it on your shoulder up the hill to the cave, and just cutting wood and stacking it and so forth, dragging chopped trees around, that kind of a thing. So, I mean, I would get some exercise, but it was mainly just like the clean living, and probably meditation helped also, that just had me in good shape. But I mean, he does have kettlebells behind him. I mean, he probably does lift weights. So it would depend on his motives. I mean, if he's doing it to be jacked, then it wouldn't be against Vinaya, I'm pretty sure. I don't think there's any rule against it, but it would be disapproved of in the suttas themselves. That, you know, I mean, you should be healthy enough to practice Dhamma, you know, for the sake of liberation. That you don't need to be beautifying yourself or, you know, impressing anybody with your musculature, that kind of a thing. So it says here, let's see, Cool Whip says, I didn't think monks were allowed to get so obscenely hench non-accidentally. Yeah, technically there's no rule against it, even though, you know, it's kind of discouraged to be exercising for the sake of self-beautification. I don't know exactly what his genetics are. Maybe he's just naturally that way, and maybe it's just the body just has these cravings for activity, and he's just, you know, alone in a cell. You know, he's just, you know, trying to maintain his healthiness by doing some calisthenics and maybe lifting the kettlebells and so forth. So, I mean, it would depend on his own chejana, his own volition, that would determine how suitable or unsuitable it was that he was doing this stuff. And I really don't know what his motives are. So, I mean, there's nothing wrong with exercising for the sake of being healthy, you know. But if you're going beyond just being healthy and just trying to be, you know, muscle bound, or, you know, just ripped or swole or whatever it is, then yeah, that would be contrary to Dhamma, but again, not technically against the rules. I mean, there are certain things that would be against rules, like swimming. You're only allowed to swim if you've got a good reason. Like, it's the only way to cross a river. You're getting away from a tiger or something, then hopefully humans can swim faster than tigers can. But swimming for fun is not allowable. But then again, if you make a distinction between just exercise for health and fun, then possibly for a monk to swim for just the sake of exercise might be allowable. Let's see. Here are the ethics on weightlifting. Yeah, I mean, you could turn it into a meditation. I mean, I'm sure that doing repetitive, you know, any kind of repetitive exercise, if you do it mindfully, could become a meditation. But still, I mean, why are you doing it? I mean, are you doing it just to be healthy? In which case, it might be okay. But if you're doing it for other reasons, like, you know, impressing people or just projecting a macho image, then it might not be so okay. But either way, it's not technically against Vinaya rules. So, yeah, and you should try to be healthy enough to practice, like, energetically, rigorously. So, I mean, you still be fairly skinny and do that, but you're not going to be a decrepit bag of bones. You know, you're not going to just be suffering from malnutrition like the Buddha was. I mean, the Buddha in his efforts during his Dukkaracharya phase, you know, when he's doing these harsh austerities, yeah, he was at the verge of death. He was so rough on himself. So the middle path between Arnold Schwarzenegger and the Dukkaracharya is, I mean, Arnold Schwarzenegger in his prime, not now. He's probably not all that ripped anymore. So, yeah. So I think I answered that. I mean, monks are supposed to be fairly thin. It does even say so in the Dhammapada. You have veins standing out on your body and so forth. But I think so long as it's just for the sake of health, exercise is fine. Just to keep you healthy enough to practice strenuous Dhamma. So I'm going to move on to the next question here. This is from Elias. And Elias says, your thoughts on this quote of Romanian philosopher Emil, I don't know how to pronounce Romanian name, Cioran. I don't even know how C is pronounced in Romanian. So anyways, this Emil says, if attachment is an evil, we must look for its cause in the scandal of birth, for to be born is to be attached. Detachment then should apply itself to getting rid of the traces of this scandal, the most serious and intolerable of all. So it seems like this philosopher is sort of implying that we should all commit suicide, which certainly would not be good Dhamma, because you just get reborn again. You didn't really solve the problem. You just sort of gave yourself a 9-month hiatus, assuming that you get reborn as a human again. So if attachment is an evil, we must look for its cause in the scandal of birth. Well, I mean, generally birth, it eventually leads to attachment, but then again, it's attachment that causes birth too, from a Buddhist point of view. So it says to be born is to be attached. Yeah, probably at the time that you're born, you got some attachments until you become enlightened. So detachment should apply itself to getting rid of the traces of this scandal. In a way, I mean, if you're practicing detachment to stop being born, that's fine. That would be in accordance with Buddhism. I don't think that birth is the most serious and intolerable scandal, because I mean, there's more intolerable scandals than simply being born. So, yeah, I guess those are my thoughts. In a way, if you interpret it a certain way, then it would be in accordance with Theravada Buddhism. But I mean, if you're saying that birth is like the direct cause of attachment and that we should all just die, then no, that would not be in accordance with Buddhism. Because, I mean, you can be born and eventually cure yourself of attachment. And I mean, you're going to be born whether you want to or not until you get enlightened, again, according to the Buddhist interpretation of this world. So I guess I gave my thoughts on that. So I'm just going to move on to Elias's next question, which is, can you describe your worst time in Burma? And I've had quite a few worst times. I had a lot of bad times in Burma, just miserable times. Like the very first time I got malaria, that was about the most sick I've ever been in my life. It was weird. It's like the first time I got malaria, it was the worst kind of malaria, falciparum malaria. It was around Christmas Day of like 1997 or 8. And it was just this killer headache. I mean, it was just like a splitting headache that nothing would work to get rid of it. Alternate days, it would be accompanied by just shivering and fever. And it got to the point, finally, it was Christmas Day, I think, when it got to the point where when I would think, it was like hearing a muffled voice coming through a closed door in another room. That was how my thoughts seemed to me. And my meditation, like the only thing I could really do was just sit there and just meditating using dukkha as a mantra, just dukkha. And just through good karma. I mean, at the monastery where I was at, there were no motor vehicles or anything. We were 13 miles from the nearest paved road at the time. It took like an hour and a half by Jeep to travel those 13 miles. And just one of my supporters just happened to show up that day. And I just remember getting up and saying, "Merry Christmas, I have malaria." And they just loaded me into the vehicle and drove me right back to town. So that was a pretty bad time. I mean, it was just like a sick time. I mean, if you want bad times with regard to just like emotional misery and not physical misery. Yeah, there were a few times when I was like very depressed, just contemplating suicide, not so much just in like I just can't bear it anymore. It's more like, what's the point of remaining alive? It just seems so pointless. It wasn't I mean, like a Buddhist wouldn't look at suicide the same way that a Christian would. That like in ancient times, a person just had the right, or like medieval Japan even, a person just had the right if they figured life was just kind of pointless, not worth the effort, that you could just opt out. But there were a few times I was very depressed. The first time, I'd been a monk for only a few years. I was living at a big school monastery near Mandalay. And I mentioned this relatively recently. I just had like this existential crisis and depression because I could not think of anything that I could not doubt. I certainly couldn't think of anything meaningful that I could not doubt. And it just caused me to just go into this bleak downward spiral. I remember one time I was going to write something down. I reached for the pencil and clumsily knocked the pencil off the table, and it landed point down, and the point broke off on the floor. And I just want to die. It's just, that was it. The point breaking off the pencil was just causing me to yearn for death. And there was the other time, I've mentioned this several times before, I suppose, that I got very sick with I think the Burmese villagers called it udupya, which is like seasonal fever, or like climate fever or weather fever. And there were times when I would get this fever at the end of the rainy season. And I was actually discussing this with Brian Rue on a video earlier today, so I shouldn't really go into too much detail. You can look at that video. But it was just, I'd been a monk for a little over 10 years at the time, and I just hit rock bottom. It was like all consolation in life was deprived of me. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't bathe, couldn't meditate. It was just this state of just chronic, just ickiness. And eventually it caused me to go into this state of just, it's all futile. What is the point? If after all these years of being a monk, I could still hit rock bottom like this, what is the point? So I even wrote to my teacher, wrote to my father saying, I'm not going to drop out of the monkhood, but I'm not going to be striving for enlightenment. I just want to take it easy now. And it was necessary for me to do that because I was trying to adopt Khmer Rouge tactics against my own defilements. It's like at war with my own mind, at war with my own personality. And it was just causing this chronic, just misery, just dissatisfaction and disgust. Because, like Schopenhauer says, I mean, fighting against your own character isn't going to work. Your character is going to win. I mean, you can't just decide to be a different person. It's going to take some kind of radical shift in your perception to cause you to become a different person. And so I was just going about Dhamma the wrong way, going about practice the wrong way. And so when I just gave up, then automatically, just almost immediately, I just started spontaneously going into these really deep meditative states, some of the best meditation of my life, just deep, just really lucid, like mindfulness of just everything, just feeling the wind on my skin and the rustling of my clothes against my skin, and just, breathing, blinking, just right there, just wide awake. So that was a bad time. It was like a crisis, a period of crisis that eventually was like a catharsis that led to something better. And like Ram Dass used to say, it's like absolute despair is a prerequisite for significant spiritual growth. And for years, I just hoped that he was wrong, but my own personal experience does seem to bear that out. Can I describe my worst time in Burma? That may be one of those. Maybe it's the worst time is just so horrible. I'm just blanking it out through hysterical amnesia or something. But maybe one of those. So, I mean, there were lots of times though when I'd just be in this state of despair or just bleakness, You know, there were times when I'd be desperate. I'd just be praying to anybody out there who can hear me and is willing to help. Please do so. You know, I didn't even believe in a God to pray to, but God, I wanted to pray to somebody because obviously I wasn't doing it on my own. I went through phases like that. So there was lots of good times and bad times as a monk. They tended to be more spiritually oriented than just the standard good times and bad times that a person has just living in a house with bills to pay. So I guess I answered that as well as I could. I mean, especially considering that it's such a short question. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Extremely Rare Bird. An Extremely Rare Bird says, I think I remember you said that your heart were opened for some time after an ayahuasca ceremony. Why do you think that happened? And that's the main question, but he continues a little bit here. I wish my heart were more open. A few times I have felt this strongly when times of calm after a period of inner turmoil for some reason, but my standard mode of being is more intellectual, detached, and probably a bit autistic. LOL. Yeah, join the club. I should probably devote myself more to metta practices, but it often feels forced to me. Yeah, join the club on that one too. I really never was able to practice metta very well just because it just seemed like I was going through the motions. I mean, you can't just turn love on and off like a faucet. I don't think it works that way. So that I think a lot of people who are practicing metta meditation are just kind of pretending, you know, kind of fooling themselves into thinking that they're beaming love to all beings when really they're just kind of cultivating this warm, glowy feeling in themselves. But getting back to this first part here, it says, I think I remember you said that your heart was opened for some time after an ayahuasca ceremony. Why do you think that happened? It's hard to say exactly why. Why do certain drugs have certain effects? I don't know the pharmacology of it. But ayahuasca, like the shamans in like South America, where ayahuasca is part of a religious thing, you know, like a spiritual movement or spiritual practice, they consider plant spirits to be sort of conscious beings, and the spirit of ayahuasca is a feminine spirit. You know, sometimes it's called the grandmother, and it does have sort of a feminine vibe to it. It's more of a heart-oriented drug than a head-oriented drug. Like something like LSD could be called a head-oriented drug. It's like a head trip. But with ayahuasca, I mean, there are times, it's pretty much every time I've taken ayahuasca, it has felt like the pain of the universe is just gushing through my chest. It's like you can relate to all the misery and horror that's going on in this world, that an intellectual person can be detached from it. But, you know, some people, especially females, I think, they're more heart-oriented and they feel that more intensely. In fact, they feel it not only, you know, coming from the world at large, but, you know, just within themselves. They're like Eckhart Tolle says, women identify with their pain body. Whatever that is, I'd never even heard of it before I read that book by Eckhart Tolle. So, I mean, you can relate to that better. You can relate to really compassionate, heart-oriented people who they just can't live with themselves unless they're out helping people, trying to alleviate suffering. There are people like those, and bless them. You know, it is good that there are people like that, but I just wasn't born that way. I'm more of a head-oriented person. So we can be more philosophical and detached. So I don't know exactly why the drug causes just this visceral heart, just convulsion, but it does, and it just kind of like blows the carbon out of the pipes, so that for a day or two afterwards, you're much more compassionate and heart-oriented, or at least that happened after the first time I took it. And I mean, it happened after that too, but not to the same degree as the first time. So, yeah, I can't say exactly why. I just know that it happened based on my own experience. So, I'm just going to read the next question from Extremely Rare Bird. And that'll be almost the last question, because I forgot to write one down. So, extremely rare bird. Second question is, what were the greatest challenges of living in a cave? Is there anything that you wish you had known in advance? The greatest challenges of living in a cave. I don't know, different caves have different challenges, I suppose. Like one cave that I lived in, at least one, if the temperature inside the cave and outside the cave was about the same, the air circulation just stopped and it became very stuffy in there. So it needed like a differential of temperature to cause like a circulation of air, because the cave was just like a corridor going like 50 feet into the side of this hill, and I'd be sleeping at the end of it. So there had to be some kind of air circulation and there wasn't. So that was just dealing with that the stuffiness of it was one. Living in caves that didn't have doors, like screen doors. You had troubles with bats and mosquitoes. There's that. That one cave that I lived in that I just mentioned that went in 50 feet into the side of a hill, it was situated such that when a certain village loudspeaker was going, and it would start at like 4 a.m, it just somehow, the acoustics just funneled that sound right into my cave. It was just like the loudspeaker was just 100 yards away instead of like a mile and a half away. So, greatest challenges of living in a cave, it's really, living in the cave was in order to reduce challenges, because the main reason why I lived in caves wasn't just because I liked living in caves. It was that living inside of a cave would be like 20 degrees Fahrenheit cooler in the hot season than outside the cave. Like you get far enough into the side of a hill and then you're going to be pretty much at the average temperature between day and night, summer and winter, just like the average annual temperature, which at that place was like 83, 84 degrees Fahrenheit. And the well water was the same way. It was like 83, 84 degrees Fahrenheit, which was nice because in the summertime it felt cool and in the wintertime it felt kind of warm. So the greatest challenges of living in a cave were probably, it was the challenges that drove me into the cave, which was just the blazing furnace-like heat of central Burma for most of the year. But yeah, there weren't any super real challenges of living in a cave. Solitude really doesn't bother me that much. Silence I like. So aside from what I mentioned, I really couldn't think of it, what the greatest challenges of living in a cave were. I mean, I got really sick with some kind of hepatitis while living in a cave once. That was kind of weird. It was, I was just so sick I could hardly stand up. I was all by myself. I was the only monk at the monastery because the other monk had been bitten by a cobra and died like 2 months previously. And for some reason, I had this song, me and Julio, down by the schoolyard, just playing in my head that I seem to have no control over. I'm just half out of it. It was just sort of like this delirious music playing in my head. Is there anything that you wish you had known in advance is the next part of this question. And gosh, I really can't think of anything that I wish I had known in advance. Maybe if I sat here and stewed over it for half an hour, but you guys would find that boring. Me just sitting here pondering for half an hour. Yeah, I guess the answer to that would be no, because I can't think of anything that I wish I had known in advance about the challenges of living in a cave. In fact, I can't really I can't really bring myself to wish I had known much of anything in advance, other than maybe, know well enough not to make certain mistakes that I have made. But with regard to living in caves, I can't think of anything. And so finally, the very last question is from Arain. And Arain asked, and I don't have it written down, I just remember her asking the question, so this won't be an exact quote, but she asked me, why is it that so many monks and other Dharma teachers too speak in this soft, slow voice with long pauses, whereas I generally speak, even when I'm teaching Dhamma, in an ordinary conversational tone of voice? And that is kind of an interesting question. I noticed Eckhart Tolle does this on his videos too. Just speak very slowly with lots of pauses, and almost like this droning, not quite whispery tone, but just this slow, sort of almost ponderous way of talking. And why some Dhamma teachers talk that way, I assume some of them are just like trying to project an image of being just meditative and wise and sort of channeling wisdom from the silence between the words or something. There could be some of that. It wouldn't surprise me. I wouldn't say that applies to everybody. That some Dhamma teachers, it may be that they're trying to cultivate like a meditative state of mind, or maybe it's just happening spontaneously with them, where they're trying to be as wise as possible. So they're trying to have their mind as calm as possible, and speaking slowly and softly helps them to cultivate this mental calm that will then help them to channel wisdom. That may be why. But in my own case, I use just an ordinary conversational tone. I'm not sure exactly why. I mean, I just talk the same pretty much to everybody, like the same kind of tone of voice. I've never really had the kind of mind that has compartments where you just go into like religious mode when you're talking about religion. There are a lot of people like that. I'd say, I don't know how many, what the percentage would be, maybe as much as half, where there are people that just have their mind is in like different rooms, and some of the rooms don't have much intercommunication with each other. But my mind is just kind of uniform. There aren't a lot of partitions in my mind. So, it's like I'm in the same state of mind. If I'm meditating or at work or hanging out at home or whatever it is, I tend to have the same general state of mind as a general rule. I mean, obviously there's going to be certain exceptions. If I'm working some machine at work, that if I'm not paying attention, I can like crush a body part or something, or just, being silly with my sweetheart, that kind of thing. There's going to be differences, but as a general rule, it's the same me. Whereas some people, like when they get into meditative mode, it's just like they sit there like a statue, because they're not having to bring their entire personality into the meditation, because they've got this special meditation room that's kind of sealed off to some degree from the other parts of their mind. And it could be that some people who are like that by temperament, they're just going to get into like the Holy Joe voice, like Holden Caulfield refers to it in The Catcher in the Rye. He can't stand the phony Holy Joe voice that preachers use. Like some preachers, I think it was Ernest Angeli, who couldn't just say the name Jesus. I mean, it always had to come out like Jesus. They just can't use an ordinary tone of voice or something like that. But I mean, Dhamma is, it's profound. It's priceless and all that. But still, if you're talking about it, then it's best just to talk about it and not try to, any theatrics, getting worked up over it. I don't know. It just doesn't work for me. But why do people talk slow with lots of long pauses when they're teaching Dhamma? Yeah, I have noticed that. And that would be my best guess. Is I would assume the main best reason for why they do that is they're cultivating sort of a calmness of mind, so that it will promote greater wisdom. They don't want an agitated mind, and then they'll say the wrong thing or get confused, or forget to say something important or something like that. So in my case, I just forget to say something important all the time and just bluster through it. And that's it. That's the last question. And the drill. Hit like, smash that like button if you haven't done so already, unless you hated the video, in which case you're silly for sitting through over an hour and 40 minutes of this. Yeah, this is less than 2 hours. This is a pretty short one, actually. And subscribe if you haven't already. And if you have any questions you think I can answer, especially about early Buddhism or Theravada Buddhism in particular, or Burmese Buddhism or monasticism or the rules of monastic discipline or meditation or just spiritual practices and philosophy in general, me personally, questions like that, that there's a good chance that I'll at least be able to fake an intelligent answer, then you're welcome to ask, and you can ask in the comments below. I am on Rumble now, largely as a reaction to the the tactics of YouTube, the sort of globalist agenda of YouTube. So I am on Rumble, also on BitChute, in addition to being on YouTube. And probably on YouTube, you still can't see my URL links. So if you want access to the other places in my other presences on the internet, as well as the books that I have for sale on Amazon, then I would advise you to look under the Rumble video of this video, or the BitChute version of this video, or an old YouTube video that's more than like 3 months old, back before I was smitten by the YouTube censors for having answered the wrong question, or answered the question in an unacceptable way. And I guess that's it. So I guess you all should just be happy. And now I gotta hit the stop record button.